Hello, this is Dr. James Camp from Lee College in Baytown, Texas, and this is my lecture on nutrition and metabolism for A&P 2. First, we're going to talk about types of nutrients, both in terms of big categories and then sort of smaller categories within those, and how those nutrients are used in the body. So first off, there are two major categories of nutrients. Macronutrients are those nutrients which are consumed to provide energy. That energy is measured in units called calories. Technically, 1 calorie is the amount of energy that is needed to heat a gram of water 1 degree Celsius. However, the calories we talk about in nutrition, we want units that provide a reasonable number of calories for something, so we actually talk about the amount of energy needed to heat 1,000 grams, a kilogram of water, 1 degree Celsius. And to make the distinction, we capitalize the word calorie here. So a capital C calorie is 1,000 grams of water. A little c calorie is what you would use in chemistry class for a single gram of water. Anyway, as you probably know, calories of energy from food are used to produce ATP, energy that can be used within our cells. Macronutrients are called macro because they're needed in tens to sometimes hundreds of grams daily. So we have to consume quite a lot of this in our diet. There are 3 categories of macronutrients. The first and usually the largest part of our diet is carbohydrates, which are collectively known as carbs, or colloquially known as carbs these days. The second category, probably should be the second largest portion of our diet, is protein, or proteins, I guess we should say, for pluralizing things. And the third is the category of lipids, which in general parlance is known as fats, though really some of them are oils, not solid fats. Okay, on the other side, over here we have micronutrients. These are not burned as fuel, so they're typically used in ways that do not consume the micronutrient. Okay, they're called micronutrients because they're only needed in milligram amounts daily. Some even in such small amounts that they're micrograms, but those are what we would call trace micronutrients. They only need to be replaced as they are lost. For example, water-soluble micronutrients are lost in the urine every time you urinate. So they have to be replaced in milligram amounts because we only lose that many, that much of them daily in urine and etc. There are 2 categories. If it's an organic molecule, it is called a vitamin. If it is an inorganic molecule, it is called a mineral. And surely you've seen vitamins and minerals explained on nutrition labels before. Okay, so we're going to now talk about each of the 3 major macronutrient categories one at a time, first as they are in our diet as we consume them, and then as they are in our body as we metabolize them. So carbohydrates are first reported on a nutrition label as the category total carbohydrates. Okay, and this would be anything that fits that C, N, H2N, ON pattern. Glucose, sucrose, starch, glycogen, the cellulose fibers that make up plant membranes, etc. Okay, these are broken down on our nutrition labels into dietary fiber, which is defined as complex carbs that we lack enzymes to digest. Okay, digest. Now, as I note down here, our gut bacteria may be able to digest some of these dietary fibers. So some of this dietary fiber goes to bulk up our feces, our stool, which helps with our overall digestive health, helps food move through our colon. Others of this is actually digested by colonic bacteria that have the ability to release important molecules from that dietary fiber, such as important vitamins and precursors for making other important molecules in our body. Okay, the other category that's broken out on our digestive labels is sugars, and these are defined as any mono or disaccharide. Okay, where monosaccharides are things like glucose or fructose. Disaccharides are things like lactose that we get from dairy, or sucrose that we get from cane sugar. Okay, these could possibly be divided a little bit better by how difficult or easy it is for our body to digest particular things. So sugars would again be one category, mono and disaccharides. These are by and large easily digested. Now there's a notable exception that I indicate here on the bottom of the screen, that lactose is initially well digested by almost every human, because when you're born, your body expects that to be your primary food source, is milk from your mother. But as we age, as most mammals, as they age, lose the enzyme lactase that digests lactose. Humans, in evolving to be a largely agricultural species that raised cows and goats and lived off of their milk, we have evolved to keep our lactase enzyme going until a much older age, some of us for our whole lives. However, there are some humans, some people who are genetically different, and they do not keep producing lactase beyond their early childhood years. And so those people we call lactose intolerant. It's not really that the lactose is bad for them, it's just that it's not digested where it's supposed to be, and so it passes on into the colon and can produce problems and issues there, disrupting the colon bacteria a little bit. Okay, the next most difficult to digest category would be starches. And a starch is basically a chain of glucose, dot, 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 usually very, very long chains of glucose. These are used by plants to store energy in their roots or in their fruits or in other in vegetable sources. These are very easy for our body to chop off 1 glucose or 2 glucose at a time using the enzyme amylase. But if you can imagine something that's thousands of glucoses long, it takes a little bit longer to break this down into absorbable sugars. So often you'll hear of people before running a 10K race or something doing what we call carb loading. And in this case, usually what they do is they eat a lot of potatoes, mashed potatoes, or pasta, or something that's a very starchy food source. And the idea is that over the hour or two that you're running this race, your body is slowly breaking down those starches into glucose, and you get a pretty steady source of energy for your muscles as compared to, say, eating a sugary cereal before you went out for your run, which would give you a quick boost of glucose and then it would all go away. Sugars, I should note, are all converted by the gut or by the liver into glucose. And glucose is then absorbed, is circulated in our blood and absorbed by most of the cells in our body and used as a food source. Several steps that we'll talk about on the next page, and glucose can be converted into a plentiful supply of ATP. So almost all the cells in our body use glucose for fuel. The notable exception, interestingly enough, is the sperm cell, which uses fructose as a fuel source. So men, power your sperm. Drink lots of high fructose corn syrup. Okay. Finally, my last category in terms of easiness to digest would be fiber, which, as we've talked about before, we do not have enzymes to digest, but our gut bacteria may be able to help us out with. Okay, so what do we do with all these carbs once we've absorbed them, digested and absorbed them? Glucose enters our cells and is broken down by a process called glycolysis. You've probably heard that before. What you probably don't know is that glycolysis takes place in a series of steps. That have intermediates such as glucose 6-phosphate and fructose 6-phosphate among them. Well, if we absorb other monosaccharide sugars such as galactose from milk sugar and fructose from corn syrup or cane sugar, those can feed into this glycolysis pathway as taking place of some of those intermediates. They can either be used to drive the glycolysis pathway forward, ending up making something called pyruvate, or they can be used to drive the whole pathway backwards in a process called gluconeogenesis, which takes place primarily in the liver. Gluconeogenesis is used, and the liver uses these pathways to turn galactose and fructose into glucose when we absorb foods containing those sugars. We can also store these intermediate products as glycogen through a process called glycogenesis, or we can break it down in what's called glycogenolysis later on. So this glycogen over here is sort of our energy storage mechanism that the liver uses for short-term energy storage. Skeletal muscles use it for short-term energy storage as well. Okay, once we have pyruvate, we have two possible outcomes. It can be converted to lactate plus 2 net ATP, 2 lactate plus 2 ATP, and that's called lactic acid fermentation, and that causes some mild muscle burn and is a major cause of oxygen debt in exercise conditions. If we have enough oxygen available, on the other hand, we can convert this to 2 acetyl-CoA molecules, which then enter the citric acid cycle, spitting out CO2 along the way, and also giving off high energy molecules that go to something called oxidative phosphorylation, which makes 34 net ATP. Trying to write net and ATP at the same time here. 34 net ATP. And in that process, it's called oxidative phosphorylation because in that process, oxygen is broken down to H2O, or oxygen is converted to H2O. Okay, so if we have oxygen, we can get a lot of ATP. If we try to do this without oxygen, we only get a little ATP. But those are the metabolic fates of carbohydrates in our body. Okay, now let's move on to lipids in our diet. Lipids are reported on nutrition labels as total fat and cholesterol. Total fat is the sum of all triglycerides present in your food. That means there's a glycerin molecule and 3 fatty acid molecules coming off of that. If all of those fatty acids have no double bonds, you get a solid fat. Usually this is animal fat, though there are some solid plant fats. And that is called saturated because it's completely saturated with hydrogen. There are no double bonds. It's called a saturated fat. If you have some double bonds that introduce kinks in that chain, okay, if you have one double bond per chain, one double bond, it's called an unsaturated fat. If you have multiple double bond kinks in those chains, you get a polyunsaturated fat. So this has multiple double bonds. It's going to be a liquid oil, and these are by far the best fats and oils for you. Things like olive oil, canola oil, and of course the very popular these days fish oil. Okay, if you take a unsaturated fat and you resaturate it by hydrogenating it, you get what's called a trans fat. And these are by far the worst for you because your body doesn't really know what to do with a artificially hydrogenated fat. And so these things just sit around and sort of, do the fat equivalent of collecting dust in your arteries, and you're more likely to get congested arteries from those than you are from any other kind of fat. So there are laws in the US at this point limiting the use of trans fats in restaurants and other things. A lot of places have voluntarily gone completely trans fat free. Okay, why do we care about these different kinds of fats? Because fats are broken down into their fatty acid acids some of which are what we call essential. Okay, they must come from our diet because they cannot be made from our body. In all people, these include the omega-3 fatty acids like ALA and the omega-6 fatty acids like LA. You typically need more omega-3s than you need omega-6s. There are certain omega-3s, DHA and EPA, that come only from fish oils that most humans are able to make from an omega-3 like ALA, but some humans lack the enzymes to do that. We're just genetically different, and so we need to get DHA and EPA from our diet. At a time when people mostly ate fish products or ate a lot of fish products, that wasn't a problem, but in today's world where fish is a relatively small part of our diet and we tend to eat cow meat or chicken meat, or pig meat, or whatever else you eat, or no meat, fish oil is decreasingly prevalent in our diet, and so a lot of mental health conditions and cardiovascular conditions are blamed on a lack of DHA and EPA in our diets. Okay, so what happens to lipids once we've absorbed them into our body? Here I'm going to talk about triglyceride metabolism primarily. I'm not going to talk about cholesterol metabolism. That's another topic. A triglyceride is stored in a fat cell. And in that fat cell, there is a process that can happen called lipolysis that breaks it down into 1 glycerol plus 3 fatty acids. Okay, those fatty acids can then leave the cell and travel through our body until they're taken up by another cell, a cell that's trying to use them for energy, and an enzyme called CoA ligase attaches them to coenzyme A, and we get what's called an acyl CoA. Now you remember you saw on a previous page on glucose metabolism something called acetyl CoA. This is a little different. It's not an acetyl, it's an acyl, a long chain lipid. Well, this goes through a cyclic process called beta oxidation. I don't know what happened to alpha oxidation, but this is beta oxidation. And we produce from that lots of acetyl CoA. Each turn through the beta oxidation cycle, we get a shorter acyl CoA and another acetyl CoA, and eventually we end up with lots of acetyl CoA. Generally, this feeds right into the citric acid cycle, and again, out we go with CO2, out we go with products for oxidative phosphorylation, and as we turn oxygen into water, we get lots of ATP. One source I looked at said about 5 ATP per acetyl CoA that we get in there. So this is obviously a little bit more involved pathway than burning glucose for fuel, so your body tends to prefer using glucose and goes to burning fatty acids when the glucose supply is depleted. In certain situations, such as what we would call carb starvation, which is when you either are literally starved for food or when you're taking part in one of these new diets that deliberately starves your body of carbohydrates, or when you're under a lot of exercise, these acetyl CoAs, instead of being used to generate lots of ATP on the site, can be used to produce something called ketone bodies. I don't know why they call them bodies. They don't have a body. They're just little molecules that float around your blood. But these ketone bodies can then cross the blood-brain barrier to fuel your nervous system, your central nervous system. They can get into muscles. They can go anywhere that energy is needed. And once they're there, they can convert back into acetyl-CoA and drive the citric acid cycle in whatever tissue they've been taken up in. There is one really bad situation here where in type 1 diabetes, an excessive number of ketone bodies is made when the body is hyperglycemic instead of hypoglycemic, and you get something called ketoacidosis, which is very, very bad for your body. Ketosis in itself is not really great for your body. It's an indication, as we said, of starvation, but it also is a normal part of extreme exercise. So sometimes it just happens. Prolonged ketosis can have bad side effects for your body. It can be hard on your kidneys, hard on your central nervous system. Some people experience headaches from ketosis, etc. Okay, then proteins in our diet. Now, protein is the simplest of these that we've talked about so far. It's reported on nutrition labels simply as protein. They don't break it down any further, which is kind of a shame because proteins are broken down into amino acids. If you paid attention in A&P1 when we talked about making proteins, you remember that we made them from amino acids, so it makes sense that they would be broken down into amino acids. There are 20 different amino acids, 8 of which are what we call essential. That is, they must come from our diet. If we ever talk about an essential nutrient, that's one that our body cannot make up for if we don't get it in our diet. So there are essential fatty acids, there are essential amino acids. And while your body technically needs glucose to run, it's not considered an essential part of your diet because you can, as we saw on the previous page, run certain pathways backwards to make alternative fuels. The 8 that are essential are isoleucine, leucine, lysine, methionine, phenylalanine, threonine, tryptophan, and valine. And in infants who haven't quite gotten their digestive system up to speed yet, the histidine is also considered essential. There are 2 kinds of protein sources. We talk about complete proteins, which includes most animal sources of protein. Most animal meats contain all 8 essentials, and so that provides a complete recipe for protein in your body. And incomplete protein, which includes most plant proteins, lack at least one of those 8 essentials. So if you're a vegetarian, especially if you're a vegan, you need to be combining different protein sources. You can't just eat tofu and expect that to provide all of your essential amino acids. Our Cajun ancestors must have known this intuitively because there are certain recipes like red beans and rice that when you combine rice protein and bean protein, they overlap just the right way to make a complete protein source. So what happens to proteins in our body after we've digested them? Well, for the most part, amino acids and proteins are broken down in our digestive tract, as we've covered in previous lectures, into amino acids. And you only really absorb amino acids. Most of the amino acids in our body are used to make more proteins, and it's only when we're really in starvation or stress conditions that we break down proteins back into amino acids. But let's say we want to burn amino acids for fuel. What we essentially do is we have to come back to our picture of pyruvate fueling, forming acetyl-CoA and feeding into the citric acid cycle. Now, I have to provide a little more detail here. Acetyl-CoA combines with a molecule called oxaloacetate to form a molecule called citrate. And then we go through multiple steps in the citric acid cycle to regenerate the oxaloacetate and spit out, as I said, a couple of CO2 molecules. We have some amino acids that can be converted directly to pyruvate. Those include alanine, glycine, threonine, cysteine, serine, and tryptophan. We have others that can be converted directly into acetyl-CoA, such as tyrosine, phenylalanine, threonine, isoleucine, lysine, and leucine. Okay, those are the most obvious inputs to the pathway. Others, such as aspartic acid and asparagine, can be converted to oxaloacetate and feed into the citric acid cycle that way. And then there are other amino acids that form other substrates in the citric acid cycle that feed in at different places. Why is this important? Well, as we know, coming off the citric acid cycle are high energy compounds that go over to our oxidative phosphorylation pathway. And as we convert oxygen to H2O, we produce lots of ATP. Now, these up here are probably your best fuel sources because they come in directly as fuel, as analogs to glucose or fatty acids. The other amino acids come in as metabolites in the citric acid cycle. They boost your metabolism, but they don't necessarily provide as direct a source of fuel. One other interesting point is that pyruvate and asparagine and aspartate can form oxaloacetate, and oxaloacetate can be run backwards through several gluconeogenic pathways to make glucose. So when your liver is trying to make glucose in a situation of carbohydrate starvation, it can often burn any of these blue circled amino acids, not burn them, but it can convert them into substrates that can be used to make new glucose. So one of your body's responses to stress is not just to break down fat, but to actually break down proteins as well. Okay. Vitamins in our diet. Let's talk about vitamins for a minute. There are two categories here: water-soluble vitamins and fat-soluble vitamins. And you might not think this is an important distinction, but it actually, what you're soluble in determines how easily you're removed from the body. Water-soluble vitamins are very easily absorbed, but they're also very, very easily and constantly removed by the kidneys. So this means that if you take one of those 1,000% RDA vitamin C supplements because you feel like you're getting sick and you need some vitamin C, you're actually mainly producing vitamin-rich urine. You're not actually going to, keep that 1,000% vitamin C in your body. It's much better to take 100% of your vitamin C every day, so that your body gets exactly as much as it's able to use, than to try to overdose that vitamin. But at the same time, it's not really a danger to overdose those vitamins because the kidneys will clear any excess. Fat-soluble vitamins are absorbed into lipid micelles and into the lymphatic system, and the excess is not cleared by the kidneys because the kidneys don't clear fat-soluble substances. So fat-soluble vitamins build up in adipose tissues, and overdosing those vitamins can lead to toxic levels. It is actually possible to have toxic amounts of vitamin A or vitamin D or something like that. So it's very important to follow the RDA recommendations on fat-soluble vitamins, to not get too little of them, but to also not get too much of them in a day either. Okay, so what are these vitamins? Well, in the water-soluble category, we have vitamin C, which is also known as ascorbic acid. And vitamin C is required for collagen synthesis, acts as an antioxidant, and may help the immune system function properly. We actually don't completely understand the link between vitamin C and the immune system, though there are plenty of products out there that will tell you vitamin C will boost your immune system. The other category in the water-soluble world is B vitamins. There are a number of different B vitamins. They have various names, like riboflavin and niacin. They tend to be coenzymes for chemical reactions, many of which have to do with those energy metabolism reactions we've been talking about on the previous several pages. So taking a supplement of B vitamins might seem like a way to speed up your energy, feel like you have more energy during the day. But again, your body's only going to use as much B vitamins as it has room for in its energy metabolic system, and the rest are just going to come out in your urine. So again, it helps to take your 100% RDA of B vitamins, but not really to take any more. In the lipid-soluble category, we have vitamin A, which is known as retinol, and it's used to produce the photoreceptor pigment retinal. Change the O to an A. And that's the primary thing that vitamin A does for you. Vitamin A is found in orange vegetables like carrots and sweet potatoes, and that's why your mother used to tell you to eat your carrots so that you'd have good vision when you were a kid. Vitamin D is known as, see if I can write this, cholecalciferol, okay, which is modified by several reactions in your body into calcitriol, which is released by the kidneys as a way to increase more calcium absorption from your GI tract. Calcium, it turns out, is actually pretty hard for your body to absorb, so you don't waste a lot of energy trying to absorb it unless this calcitriol is present to coax you along. Vitamin E is also known as tocopherol. You'll often see vitamin E on one of your vitamin supplement packages as, vitamin E as mixed tocopherols. So there are actually a couple of different forms of vitamin E out there. Vitamin E is helpful to cell membranes. And that's about as much as I know about it. Finally, vitamin K is required to produce a lot of your blood clotting factors. If you remember back to our section on hemostasis, many of the blood clotting factors that help you maintain hemostasis require vitamin K in the liver for their synthesis. Okay, minerals in our diet and body. So probably the most important mineral in our diet, or one of the most important, is iron. Iron is very difficult for our body to absorb, and so we need a lot of it. Most commonly, we get it from meat, poultry, and fish because animal muscle has a lot of iron in it. Or from dark green leafy vegetables, nuts, and whole grains. Also, red kidney beans have iron. It is used, obviously, as you remember from our blood chapters, it's used within hemoglobin to bind oxygen. Calcium is another important daily intake from dairy products or from green vegetables. It's used to form and maintain bone and tooth matrix. It's obviously important in neuromuscular function as a signaling ion, and it's used in clotting factor activation, as we talked about in our hemostasis chapter. So you need plenty of that every day to keep your body running and to keep your bones strong. Iodine is needed to produce thyroid hormone that sets your basal body metabolism. And our main modern source of that is actually iodized salt. It was noticed that there were a lot of people who had hypothyroidism at some point, and so public health people decided to start adding iodine to all of our salt. Now that people are starting to use this sort of organic sea salt stuff, it actually is hurting our ability to keep iodine in our diet. Zinc comes from meat or from seeds. It's needed for gene expression, protein synthesis, wound healing, reproductive function, central nervous system regulation, and has recently been linked with certain antiviral functions. We have sodium and potassium that serve opposite roles in maintaining membrane potentials. Sodium rushes in during an action potential, potassium rushes out. You remember all of that. Sodium obviously comes from table salt. Potassium, for some reason I didn't make notes here on what potassium comes from, so you'll have to look that up on your own. And finally, magnesium comes from spices, nuts, cereals, vegetables, and oddly enough, cocoa. So if you ever wondered if there's a health product benefit for chocolate, it's magnesium. It's essential for nucleic acids and for enzyme biochemistry, including maintaining several hundred enzyme functions in your body and maintaining the function of ATP. Okay, let's wrap up real quick with a set of basics of nutrition and then wrap this up. Macronutrient balance comes in simply as sugars and starches are your body's easiest to use source of calories. Carb starvation diets, though they can cause you to lose weight quickly, are ultimately not good for your body, and I've never seen anybody scientifically legitimate recommend a carb starvation diet for more than a week or two. Get the weight off if you have to that way, but then switch to a balanced diet that includes a healthy amount of carbohydrates for your body and especially for your central nervous system. Fiber is essential to the health of your digestive tract, so soluble fiber decreases blood levels of so-called bad cholesterol, and it also bulks up your stool, as we talked about, so for digestive health itself. So even if you are on a low-carb diet, be sure you're still eating plenty of fiber. Lipid requirements. Most fatty acids can be synthesized by our body. There's an exception, alpha-linoleic acid and linoleic acid, so-called omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. And some people cannot make the longer chains, such as docosahexaenoic acid, the DHA, the active ingredient in fish oil. Cholesterol can be synthesized by the liver in limited amounts per day, so it's not really an essential for your diet to include cholesterol. We used to think it was actually bad to have cholesterol in your diet, but we now think a limited amount of cholesterol is probably good for you as long as you keep it within reasonable limits. For protein, most amino acids can be synthesized by our body except for those 8 essential amino acids we talked about earlier. Those can be gotten by eating complete proteins or by careful combination of incomplete plant proteins. The most important part of macronutrient balance, though, is calorie balance or energy balance. In order to maintain a healthy weight, your calories in has to equal your calories burned. So if you think of your body as a calorie burning machine, calories in, calories out, and whatever is left, or if you have more in than out, you're going to add fat to your body. If you have more out than in, you're going to subtract a little bit of weight from your body. So to lose weight, calories in must be less than calories out. And that's a real simple thing. How do you get more calories out than calories in? Well, you limit your calories in by limiting your food intake. And that's probably the main effect of low-carb diets, is that they're just limiting your food intake. Nobody eats that much protein and fat. Calories out you can affect by increasing your metabolism. To know how much calories out, calories out basically breaks into two categories. We have basal metabolic rate, and we have exercise. Your basal metabolic rate varies by your biological sex, your height, your weight, even where you live. If you live in Houston, you're going to burn fewer calories keeping your body warm during the day than if you live in, say, Alaska. A typical woman in the U.S. burns 2,000 calories a day, a typical man 2,500. I've seen some of these estimates going down in recent years that have suggested that really a maintenance weight for a woman should be about 1,800 calories a day. For a man, it should be more like 2,200 a day. Exercise metabolism adds to the number of calories you burn every day. So if you do a 300 calorie exercise every day, then you can add 300 to your BMR, and that equals your cals in. So let's say I'm a typical man who's burning 2,200 calories for my BMR, and I do a 300 calorie exercise a day. Then to maintain my weight, I need 2,500 calories in. If I'm trying to lose weight, I'd cut that down to about 2,000 calories in, and now I'm actually burning more than I'm taking in, and I'm going to have a net loss of weight, which I hope will come from fat. In order to maintain a healthy weight, calories in must equal calories out. It actually does not matter for calorie balance whether the calories come from carbs, fats, or proteins. Okay, so your low-carb diet doesn't actually change your calorie balance if you eat as much calories from fat and protein as you used to eat from carbohydrates. Caveat number one, fats have more calories per gram than carbs or proteins, so each gram of fat that you eat actually gives you more, twice as many calories. Let me say that again. Every gram of fat you eat gives you twice as many calories as every gram of carbs you eat. So switching from a high carb diet to a high fat diet actually hurts you. Caveat number two, though, proteins make you feel full. They increase something called satiety, or sense of feeling full, in your stomach and small intestine, so you're tempted to eat less. So increasing your protein intake can help you feel full better, faster. If you want an easy way to lower your calories on a diet, replace one meal a day with a protein bar that is going to make you feel full and allow you to otherwise kind of skip that meal. For various reasons, experts suggest the following balance of macronutrients: 45 to 65% of calories, not grams, calories from carbohydrates, 20 to 35% of calories from fat. Remember to include your essential fatty acids. And 10 to 35% of your calories from protein, which you have to make sure it's complete protein, so either eat an animal protein source or a mix of plant protein sources.